Hey everybody, today I'm so excited. I have Isaac Kohane on the podcast, and he is the head of biomedical informatics at Harvard. He started a lab there, grew it, has an amazing story to tell us. He is now the editor-in-chief for the New England Journal of Medicine in AI. He has so much experience in medicine, in AI. I think you're going to love this conversation. Enjoy. All right, Zach, welcome to the podcast.
Really glad to be here, Jared. Looking forward to the chat.
Awesome. Well, as always, I like to have the audience kind of understand you and where you come from. So if you don't mind telling us, how did you end up where you're at, knowing what you know?
All right. So I can't help but start at the beginning, but I'll be very succinct.
That's okay.
So I grew up in Switzerland, and even though I have this American accent, I didn't become a naturalized American until I was 25. And I came here for college. Didn't have anybody in my family who was a doctor. And when I went to college at Brown back in the late 70s, in 1977, I ran into IBM mainframes. I'd never worked with computers before, and that was very exciting. But I went on to medical school as I'd planned, and I was just horrified when I started medical school. I realized, wow, this is wonderful. It's great. It's just an honor to work with patients. But boy, this is not a science. And so I kind of had a weird freak out, and I did the kind of dropping out that I could as an immigrant tolerate, which is I went and got a PhD in computer science in artificial intelligence for a period of several years, working with my thesis advisor and still current collaborator at MIT, Peter Solovitz. And so this was old school AI from the 1980s, where it was more rule-based systems, rather where you sort of give it the rules and from experts, and that sort of guides the program, rather than where we are today, where we have data driving the AI. And so, to make a long story short, I came back to medical school as urged by my thesis advisor. Finished medical school training, did pediatrics residency, then a pediatric endocrine residency, and then finally got back to my research. Started a lab, which became a Harvard Medical School Center, which became a department. And now I'm chair of this department that I started with a bunch of really smart quants doing a variety of research projects, from AI applications to cancer genomics.
Wow. I love that you dropped out to a PhD and then a residency and a fellowship. And I'm curious, do you still see patients?
I still see patients, occasional rare disease patients. Something I've been involved in the last 15 years is something called the Undiagnosed Disease Network, where we see patients who have not been diagnosed after many years. And we apply a bunch of techniques, including whole genome sequencing. But it turns out that most, I think, of the value of what we do, because genome sequencing has become commoditized, is just sitting down, slowing down, saying, what's going on? And frankly, sometimes we're able to, in as many as 7 to 10% cases, without doing anything more than review the record, diagnose these patients.
Yeah.
So that's my clinical hobby.
Okay. Well, I mean, that's one of the coolest. It's like the doctor house of doctor houses. Like you take the patients that nobody's been able to diagnose and figure that out.
And by the way, I should put an advertisement for it. It's free. It's NIH supported. If you know someone who's undiagnosed, just Google Harvard Undiagnosed Network, and there's a path to sending in your application where you can describe the condition and you get evaluated.
Very cool
for the network.
And are they usually children or adults that come in?
It's about half, but truth be told, the half that are adult, you can go back, and half of them already had the signs of this undiagnosed disease as children. We're just picking them up as adults.
Oh, fascinating. Okay. Well, I honestly could spend the next hour just asking you questions about that, but
it is fascinating because it's a microcosm of everything that's wrong in medicine. Right. And among the things that we do that has very little to do with diagnosis, but everything to do with patients is with patient consent, we upload all their data, their clinical data, the genomic data, into the cloud, the AWS cloud. It's HIPAA certified, so that we have 12 academic centers that are involved in this network, funded by the National Institutes of Health. and wherever the patients are, the data goes with them,
Yeah.
which is not the standard of care in medicine, where we basically have to start retesting everybody because we never get the results from the other.
Right. Yeah. So actually, maybe let's just build off that a little bit. So you said it's kind of this microcosm of everything that's wrong in medicine. One of those things is information sharing. What are some of the other things that you see that you're able to use inside of this small cohort of patients that you wish could be like more broadly used in medicine?
Well, the patients are not chained to a particular healthcare system.
Hmm.
What we look at, what's the problem? Who are the experts? And if the patient is normally seen at Vanderbilt, but the world expert is at Stanford,
Hmm.
at least a virtual consultation, sometimes actually going there. And we so what we do is we, by virtue of the fact that we have the patient consent that they can share their data and the institution's agreement to share their data, we can actually bring the expertise where it's needed. Whereas sometimes patients don't know who the expert is. And frankly,
Right.
a lot of doctors don't know who the expert is, but there's a lot of vested interest, financial and just convenience, in not moving the patient. So that's number one. The other is the problem that I see, and it's when I think AI has a lot to say about, is spending a little bit more time with the patient, actually
Hmm.
listening to them, going through all the problems, reviewing the entire history. And it's just very hard to do when you're in a situation where you have to see patient after patient very, very fast. And there are ongoing pressures in the healthcare system just to see patients more and more. And this grant from the government basically allows us to spend on the first evaluation literally a couple of hours.
Hmm.
And that may seem extravagant, but these patients actually cost the healthcare system tens of thousands of dollars, even $100,000 a year, just because
Wow.
they keep
Yeah.
getting tested, retesting, and no answers. And so it's sort of penny wise, pound foolish to rush these patients, because you just keep on passing them around and no answers and continued expenditure, and of course, most of all, suffering.
Hmm.
So that's another sort of a bug in the system. And yeah, I think that those are the main, but data
Yeah.
sharing, bringing the data with the patient, um, providing access to expertise across institutional boundaries, and on those cases that are truly difficult or unusual, spending the time they deserve.
Yeah. I I think that is a great microcosm to look at, and I think it's a really great kind of even to ask the question, what can AI do to solve each of those problems? And so, and I'll just give a real quick anecdote for myself with the medical specialist thing. So my father, he had colon cancer, and when they found his colon cancer, they did an upper GI endoscopy, and they found a little smidgen of something concerning in his esophagus, and they said they were supposed to watch it, and it just it's like one of those things that doesn't get caught. Like his PCP never saw it in the report, and 5 years go by until he starts having some blood loss, gets an upper endoscopy, and he has esophageal cancer. And and so that, of course, like I'd love that if we each had like our own AI surveillance, watching our medical record and finding things like that and making sure they don't slip through. But then he went to his local surgeon, who said, "Okay, I'm going to have to crack open your chest. I'm going to cut out a piece of your esophagus. I'm going to, sew you back together." And I told him, I was like, "Wait, he lived in Utah, and they have a good cancer institute there, the Huntsman Cancer Institute." And I said, "Hey, why don't you go up to Huntsman and just see? I know it's an hour drive, but let's just see." And they fixed it with a small endoscopy procedure and the right specialist. And not everybody needs the right specialist, but I think it's interesting to think, like, what if we actually had some smart routing of patients, and the boundaries of the healthcare system didn't really matter. Um,
I, I'll give you a much lower stakes version of that. That's personal.
mhm.
So my late mother loved talking to her doctor. So for her, I bought her a concierge doctor. That's expensive.
Yeah.
And but then she passed away, and I inherited him, and so I've continued to use him. And so this is a very nice guy, who went from having 3,000 patients to 300 patients.
Hmm.
So you think they'd have a lot of time to focus. And so I had, I think, just turned 60, and he knew that my father had a history of cardiovascular disease, so he did a cholesterol lipid panel on me, and then I didn't hear anything, so I assumed that my cholesterol profile was fine. A year later, I see him on my next visit, and I said, "How's it going?" And he says, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, I assumed that my lipid profile was fine." He said, "Oh, let me look." "Oh, no, you should be on a statin." And I was thinking to myself, nothing wrong really happened for being delayed
Yeah.
by a year.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, this is one of the sort of the basic
Mhm.
things that primary care doctors are supposed to do, which is look at the guidelines, put you on. And this guy has only 300 patients.
Right.
And here, all we needed was a little AI that says, hey, we did the cholesterol check. That's a pretty substantial LDL. Shouldn't we have a conversation with him? So
Yeah.
but unlike your dad, this is happening to hundreds of thousands of Americans every year. We know fact
Yeah.
there's a reason there's a guideline is because Americans are not treated aggressively enough about their cholesterol.
Right. Well, I think it brings up some really interesting questions. And so I want to dig in on AI, but real quick, I want to level set on what are the different AI systems and predominantly what is the AI system that we're most interested in today that we're kind of hearing a lot about. And so if you don't mind kind of explaining, generally what is
Sure.
AI and yeah.
Okay. So unlike some people, I don't think it's worth getting too anxious about what AI means and getting too particular because it's used in such a sloppy way. I think you'll be in good company if you just say AI are computer programs that uh, have some quality of human level expert reasoning to provide assistance or autonomous um, assistance in a task or an
Hmm.
advice. And they used to be very specialized. So, for example, back before 2017, most of the AI programs that we were using, and that was a very exciting era already, were specialized um, visually focused neural networks that just like they could identify a cat in a in an Instagram posting, could look at the picture of your retina and actually say, oh, you have retinal disease. And these programs are very narrowly focused on a particular task to decipher something in an image. And so these so-called supervised neural networks were very supervised. It means that you tell it what's good, what's bad, what diagnosis it is, and then it figures out based on repeated labeling of these cases what kind of classification or prediction task you want to do. And then I'll try to stay away from the technical part of it. And then there was this paper that came out in 2017 out of Google of all places. And I say of all places because it's a place where we should have expected it to come out of, but um, all the monetization of this program really came out of OpenAI and other companies
Hmm.
who read the paper and acquired the people who had written the paper. So what this paper described is a kind of neural network called a transformer, where it's much more capable than what I'm going to say. But the simplest and early use case was to say, I'm going to look at all the literature, all the words across all the internet, and I'm not going to just say what we used to do, which is which words have the shared company. In other words, we used to be able to uh, just by saying, oh, this word typically has these words around it.
Hmm.
And therefore, that's kind of what its meaning is. In other words, if you're talking about uh, a male who has a throne, has a scepter, and is married to a queen, that's probably a king. And the transform architecture took it another step forward, not just what were statistically the nearby words, but specifically in sentences. Given what the sentence was so far, what was the next word that you'd expect? And that takes obviously a lot of computation, but this led to what the general public first learned about in fall of 2022, Chat GPT.
Hmm.
And Chat GPT was a program developed at OpenAI in collaboration with Microsoft. And so that's the transformer architecture, of which now there are literally hundreds of different competing models from different companies. And if you want, we can talk about at a sort of cocktail party level conversation, what are for the general public and for doctors, what are the pros and cons of those different models?
Yeah, I think that's a good place to go next because I want to get us back to, okay, let's think about alerts for doctors and how AI might work in there, or education for patients, or even data intake. I mean, if we can't sit down 2 hours with each patient, can we use AI? So yeah, I think let's start to talk about like what AI models are kind of good for what.
Okay. First of all, there's a very boring but important distinction that people should know. Um, and I became aware of it early on when uh, I was writing a book with Peter Lee, who's the head of Microsoft Research, and I was being very attentive to how doctors were using it, and I saw, and I was very happy for them, doctors tweeting about the fact that they were pasting the patient history into Chat GPT and asking Chat GPT to write an authorization letter to the insurance company to authorize them to use. And when I saw that, I winced because ChatGPT, as used then, was primarily through OpenAI. OpenAI, although it works with Microsoft, is not Microsoft. And so
Mhm.
there was not the legal technical surround around that to ensure privacy or compliance with HIPAA. So technically speaking, all those doctors were violating HIPAA.
Right.
And so as a doctor to my doctor friends, if you're going to be putting in identified patient data, the first most important thing I need to tell you is make sure you have a large language model that has been certified uh, for HIPAA. And so, what does that mean? That means that they're programs that are going directly to Microsoft's HIPAA-controlled cloud instance of GPT-4, or that it's through another HIPAA compliant AWS account as opposed to a non-HIPAA compliant AWS account. So that's very, very basic. But the last thing I want to hear about is doctors who are getting into legal trouble for using non-HIPAA compliant large language models.
Yeah.
Having said that, um, today in 2024, um, from the patient perspective and the doctor perspective, it's most useful to be able to load up all your PDFs um, and all the text about these patients. And what's great is the public consumer facing models, Gemini from Google, Claude from Anthropic, um, GPT-4 from OpenAI and Microsoft all allow you to have a set of documents that you can upload and use as part of your prompt. So that's really important, except again, patients can do this,
Yeah.
but on these public instances, doctors can't. And so right off the bat, and we're getting again a little bit too involved in the weeds, but this is what we were dealing with. Doctors, if they're involved with actual identified patient data, have either to go through a cloud implementation that is certified to be HIPAA, or that goes in through a infrastructure that's certified to be HIPAA. So, for example, if you're using essentially GPT-4 through your electronic health record vendor, the electronic health record vendor has made sure that large language model is in a HIPAA certified mode. But because of that differential, you're seeing much more interesting cases, in my opinion, from patients using large language models than doctors, because even if the doctors are using it, they can't actually be public about it because they would be setting
Right.
themselves immediately up for a lawsuit, frankly. But patients are allowed to do what they want with their own data, and we're seeing patients literally taking all the PDFs from the portal or from a lab report and saying, especially when they're not happy with their care or where they're continuing to suffer or where they have some additional questions that were not answered in the last visit, they're just saying, GPT-4 or Claude, tell me what's wrong with me. And we have some really great examples now of patients using this very effectively and
Yeah,
scarily, because it's also uses that have not been particularly well studied.
right. And I'm curious what you think, as a physician, you always kind of dread that moment when the patient says, well, I read on Google. And now that's no longer I read on Google. It's I asked GPT. And I'm curious how you think about kind of should doctors be more excited that the patient is on GPT and looking things up, or like would you tell patients if you're going to do one, GPT has a higher probability of giving you good data than if I read random articles on Google. How do you kind of think about that?
So I think it's really important to think about who. I always like to say we have to think about the healthcare system we have rather than the healthcare system we'd like to have.
Right.
And so thinking on the perspective of the patient, absolutely use this as a second opinion.
Hmm.
Absolutely. I mean, you're only having a short doctor visit. Your doctor may be great, but is not omniscient. And there may be something that you forgot to tell them. Also, you can ask more questions. You may have questions. All of us, when we see doctors, we forget to ask questions or tell them things. And then afterwards, oh, I should have. But then you have to wait another 6 months to tell them. And so having that second opinion or that assistant to ask questions and think about alternatives that you didn't have, I think is incredibly important. From the doctor perspective, yes, it's no question that this is better than search, because
Hmm.
search, Dr. Google, or search in general, has at least two different problems. One is, first of all, advertisements are the first set of results that you get back, and that's hardly unbiased. And then the rest of it is reputational. And sometimes the craziest uh, therapies or diagnoses are the most popular. And so that's
Right.
also not particularly good. And what's nice about these large language models is for the moment, this could change in a bad way, but for the moment, they're trained on pretty official medical
Hmm.
content. And that could change. But so from the doctor's so the theoretical doctor would say, wow, that's better. The reality
Hmm.
is doctors are under incredible pressure.
Yep.
And when a patient comes and has more stuff to tell them, especially a divergent opinion, and they have to explain either why that's correct or incorrect,
Hmm.
and especially if it's something that's outside their expertise, that's a nightmare. It's just a
Right.
nightmare. And these doctors are human beings. They're getting weekly emails from their department chair saying, "You got to see more patients, otherwise, your bonus is not going to be as good. We need to make those RVUs." And so, and by the way, this is a broader problem because the same reaction is when patients come and they say, "I want to share with you all my glucoses from my continuous glucose monitor." Most doctors are not going to see that. But
Right.
I do say, and I know we're getting ahead of ourselves, I do say that in very short order, I've already seen some patients do it. They give all their glucoses from their CGM to
Mhm.
GPT-4 and say, "Could you please summarize? Is there anything I could do to improve my glucose control?"
Right.
And we don't have a model right now in medicine to allow doctors to become expert and data scientists in that way.
Hmm.
Eventually, we'll have the AI infrastructure to help them. Right now, we
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah. Here's a little bit of a selfish question because at Bionic Health we've been building on top of building the CHR that we're trying to integrate with models, and we've been struggling to know, like, so a patient can go out to Chat GPT and put in all their data, but what if we already have all their data and we have the most advanced AI models, and like where as a health system do you sit in combining those two things and saying, hey, this isn't reliable but it's convenient for you and it's HIPAA compliant, you're not going to expose your data to anybody else, but is there like an imbued trust on the healthcare institution that you will only give reliable advice? And we know that the AI is not always reliable, and so I kind of wonder how you think through that, because that's like a real world problem that I
It's
think we
absolutely a real
deal
world.
with.
But let's
Yeah.
be clear. Where are the real uses? I mean, the reason that you and I are talking because I'm thrilled with what you're doing.
Hmm.
And but if you look at large healthcare systems, even the most progressive ones, how are they actually using AI? Basically, in two ways. One is around pretty circumscribed communication things. So
Hmm.
discharge summaries rendered into human, layman, intelligible summaries to patients.
Yeah.
And so, or a report to a referring doctor. So, sort of clinical administrative communications. By far, the biggest applications of AI are around revenue cycle.
Hmm.
Go into the record. How can we upcode the diagnoses to actually maximize reimbursement? The kind of thing that you're talking about, and that we were both talking about, is in fact of the greatest benefit to patients and clinical care. But there's also risk,
Yeah.
and therefore, large healthcare systems are not likely to make that their first or second or third priority, because the right answer, of course, is that you need a human in the loop.
Yep.
And at the level of large hospitals, they don't have that infrastructure in place for human in the loop.
Yep. Yep. And so this brings me to, let's go back to the, say you have an AI surveilling each patient. How good does that AI need to be if we know, like your anecdote, like my anecdote, we know doctors are missing things, and maybe it's at like 75%, and an AI only gets it to 90%. Is that okay, or is it worse because now we have doctors assuming that the AI is perfect?
Well, that
Um,
you see, that, that's an interesting. You went to the right place, but you didn't go where I thought you were going to go. But you
you
went
could take it either
to the
way.
right place. So I think the most important, people talk about we need to train doctors about AI and so on. I think the most important thing we have to do is to train doctors to be critical and awake about what AI says,
Yeah.
and to have the same critical view as if they had a young intern telling them,
Hmm.
"Well, I saw this. Is this a problem?" And they need to think about it. And
Yeah.
and I apologize for those who don't like Tesla and Musk, but I happen to own a Tesla, and so I've very vividly seen a great model of how to deal with um, critical thinking.
Hmm.
So when I drive a Tesla, and I'm a very poor driver, and frankly, I drive better with the autopilot on. But however, every once in a while, it does something crazy that if I let
Hmm.
it do it, I think it might kill me.
Yeah.
It gets into a intersection and starts hesitating, and it's not quite sure what to do. And I think for that reason and liability issues,
Hmm.
what Tesla does, it requires you to keep your hands on the steering wheel and to move it a little so that the car knows that you're actually paying attention. And I thought I had that covered, but it turns out I was just doing that. It also looks at you
Uh,
with cameras. And since I'm a terrible, irresponsible driver, I will pick up my phone and I'll look, just, and it sees that, and a red light appears on the screen and says, "Pay attention." And if you do it a couple times, it says, "Okay, you don't listen to me. I'm switching off autopilot."
mm,
And then when you reach home and you park the car, it says, "That's nice, Zach. You really did something irresponsible. If you do this 4 more times, I'm switching off autopilot for good until the next software update."
mm,
And so I do think that we're going to have to, the driver here is the doctor. We're going to have to tell
yeah.
them, you have to stay awake at the wheel. And we may have to play tricks like
Yeah.
putting crazy things into the note and say, whoa, you said that note was okay, but you didn't see that we said there's a clown walking around on a unicycle next to the patient. Excuse me?
They'll probably just use another GPT to check it for them, just like my middle school student, my daughter, who is always trying to hack the next AI
Yeah, yeah, you're
wearable
absolutely right.
device.
But that is the information warfare that we can face. But you're absolutely right. We have to get a culture of trust but verify.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, actually, I love that example because this is something that I've thought about for years, just with my kind of history of ambient note writing, right? And so we would ask ourselves, do we need to put crazy stuff in the note?
Yeah,
Because there will become a point where you're 98% or something that's really pretty good, and the physician will just trust and not verify.
yeah,
And that becomes dangerous. And so thinking through, is it, amount of time spent checking a fact? is it because that's kind of what Tesla is doing? Is they're saying amount of time, with hands on the wheel or eyes on the road. And so, do we need to come up with something like that internally in our systems? Why do you think there is such a different standard for technology compared to humans? Because I mean, some people would argue turn on Tesla self-driving for everybody today, and we have less deaths on the highway compared to human driving.
Yeah,
And so
I think
why is
that's.
there
I
that
think
difference?
for primary care, I think let's look at my cholesterol example. If we had
Hmm.
something overlooking and just tweaking both doctors and patients, hey, you guys should have a conversation about whether or not Joe should be on a statin, both to the doctor
Hmm.
and to the patient. Just say,
Yeah.
could you please talk about just doing that would probably reduce cardiac disease. Both you and I have an intuition that probably in terms of maximizing expected utility, in terms of maximum benefit to society, unleashing these things today, whether self-driving or automated decision support through large language models, probably net will improve lives, avoid deaths, avoid errors, and so on.
Hmm.
So why are we so touchy about it? Because there's plenty of poor doctors. There's
Yeah.
plenty of um, doctors who are just being human who miss things. We know that we kill a lot of
Yeah.
patients through errors.
Yeah.
So why do we give it a different standard? I can think of only two things off the top of my head. One is uh, we accept the fallibility of humans,
Hmm.
and we're used to we're used to treating computers as deterministic, and it's supposed to perform at a certain level. And if it doesn't, it's a bug. But these programs, because they're actually trained on our data, are very much fallible in the same ways that we are. But culturally, we're not used to it. But the other part
Yeah.
is the medical legal culture.
Hmm.
Because right now, if you make a mistake, even using AI, the doctor is going to be sued because
Yep.
you, doctor, decided to use it. And that doesn't sit well with doctors or the medical establishment. And
Right.
so there's going to have to be either a legal precedent or some strategic decisions between the Googles, the Microsofts, the Anthropics of the world, and the
Hmm.
healthcare system uh, to perhaps share some liability and responsibility.
Hmm.
So these are crass considerations,
Yeah.
uh, but between that sort of psychological perception of difference between a human and a computer program, and that distinction, I think, is going to become less and less obvious. Um, and the weird artifact of medical legal liability, at least those two things are why we have that difference.
Yeah. I think most doctors, and I'll put myself in this bucket. I probably think I'm a better doctor than I really am.
Yeah,
Like, I
we all
think
do. We all
most
do.
humans, I mean, there's all sorts of funny stats. Like if you screen bosses and ask them how good of a boss they are, everybody thinks they're in the top 10%. I think even with lovemaking, there's like some funny statistics
Yeah,
about that. Everybody thinks they're in the top 10%. And so, like most doctors, if you said, hey, I'm going to give you this AI that won't miss things 98% of the time, but if it misses on those 2%, you're going to be liable. um, it's possible that doctors would be like, well, I'm close to 100%. So,
yeah,
like,
right. I would never do that stupid thing. And another reason is even though on average these things are, I would argue, better. There's been many studies now that show these things are actually
mhm,
better on average than, let's say, primary care doctors. But the errors that they make are not the errors we would make.
right.
The errors look dumb to us.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, and so even though it's actually catching some more sophisticated problems that not perhaps, definitely lead to more death because they are making dumb things. He's saying, "Whoa, that is just stupid. Why are we relying on this thing?"
Right. Yeah. I have a question that will touch on your role at the New England Journal of Medicine. One thing that I think is interesting is watching as studies have come out is often the studies are using older models or they're using, single agent. And you see like Microsoft and Google, when they will benchmark, they're many times using multi-shot and multi-agent, meaning that they're having several AIs look at this and get to like 99th percentile on something. And so at NEJM, how do you guys kind of think about, you know, how to what to publish? Because it's this really weird thing where I think we see, things go to Arvix or the web kind of publication versus kind of traditional peer review publication.
Yeah. So that that is something I worry about a lot and think about a lot. So first of all, um, the NEGM AI is only about a year and a half old now at this point. But I was offered the to be editor in chief of NEGM AI about 5 years ago, and when they approached me, the colleagues, I'm on the editorial board of NEGM, and when they approached me and said, "We'd like you to start this journal," I said, "Absolutely not. There's not enough good articles
Mm,
to be published." Now, Chat GPT accelerated that quite a bit, and yet there's several problems. There's the problems that you just mentioned, using uh, older technologies, using just one model and so on. But there's actually a deeper problem. Most of the studies are retrospective. They
mm,
take data from the past and they say, can we predict this?
right.
If this, and if we use this, do we think it would make a difference? The problem is you can't tell. And the only way you're going to actually be able to answer these questions are through prospective studies,
Hmm.
or in plain English, a going forward trial.
Yeah.
Now, going forward trials take years if you want to show patient impact. So what I've been pushing very hard on is when someone sends me a retrospective study, I tell them, interesting study, and you may want to publish in these other uh, less medical journals where this is interesting, great that you can predict this retrospectively, but I want to know whether it's going to make a difference.
Hmm.
And so there's several levels of making a difference. So instead of doing a full-on original article where it's a study, I'd love to see a case study where you
Hmm.
actually use it prospectively. Did it change doctor behavior? Because if it didn't change doctor behavior, then it's not going to change patient outcomes for if in the doctor use case. And so I'm encouraging people to submit, and we're getting prospective case studies. And frankly, even if the technology is older, but it's prospective, I'm saying,
Hmm.
that's interesting. And um, by virtue of the way the world works, we end up getting, as all journals get, more positive studies than negative studies. There's a bias if
Hmm.
things didn't work. So if I get a prospective study and indeed patient outcomes improved, I think that's worth knowing about.
Yeah.
But it does mean that there's going to be a lag in our evaluation. But I think it's worthwhile because the alternative is what's happened, frankly, with the FDA. FDA has approved maybe over 600 software as medical devices, more of these old school, narrowly
Hmm.
defined, narrow medical task supervised learning, like the ophthalmology example.
Yeah.
600 of these, but almost none of them are being used.
Right.
And and I think it's very simple. Doctors actually want to use something because you have to change things. You have to be bothered. You have to
Yeah.
change your workflow in order to include these things. And
Hmm.
so either you have to have something that immediately changes your workflow, like ambient dictation,
Hmm.
or changes your work in a way that is going to help patients, even without looking at what the outcomes are, or you need the actual outcomes.
Hmm.
So, I'm having a very interesting conversation with both the authors as well as with my co-editors about, because we're really trying to mold the field. We don't want to publish things that are going to mislead doctors. At the same
Yep.
time, we want to help the field go forward. So if something looks hopeful, we want to publish it as it is,
Hmm.
as a case study, not
Right.
as a sort of just tell where we are today. But I don't want to present this as go for it. And
Right.
so, for example, we got this. We published recently a very nice study coming out of Duke and Apple Computer about the use of devices to do allow parents to do remote evaluation to accelerate the diagnosis of autism.
Mm.
And and it did work pretty well. But it was in fact done prospectively, but they did it on a artificial population, that is a population that had already been referred. So there's a 50% likelihood that you're going to have
Right.
autism. That makes it much easier. If you are trying to identify the 1 in 2 people who have
Yeah.
autism versus the 1 in 100, it's a different
Yeah.
story. So I said, great, but we're going to publish this as a case study not
Mm.
as a full original article. And they were okay with that. Uh,
Okay.
but that's part of what we're having to deal with, because taking care of patients is, in fact, serious business.
Yeah.
And it's one thing if you're a desperate patient who is not getting enough time for the doctor. Use the large language models. God bless you. Use it carefully. But in the end, it's limited harm that you can do to yourself, because in the end, you're going to go to a doctor with the recommendation. But if you're a
Right.
doctor using these models, I want to make sure we're not wasting your time. I want to make
Hmm.
sure that we're giving you the best advice. And so the missing piece is evaluation. And that's really what I'm focused on: clinically meaningful evaluation.
I love that. The ability, like you said, to give really great tools to doctors that are validated, that we know have good resources for behind them, and so that we actually help you with a very, very difficult task. And then for the patients, like, yeah, use these things and see if they help. I wonder if you could leave us, since you have so many kind of anecdotes where AI has been helpful for
Right.
patients. I wonder if you could leave us with an anecdote where you've seen this.
Well, I have a friend of mine who's a doctor at a very important institution, not Harvard. And unfortunately, he developed some neck pain, and he thought it was a disc. And they set up an MRI, and then they found out that he actually had a tumor in his spine.
Mm.
And so he got operated upon, and the tumor was sequenced and genotyped. And this was early on when I was writing that book, that AI book with Peter Lee. And so I had
Yeah.
early access GPT-4. And so his wife told me what the diagnosis was, and she sent me the mutations. She says, what do you think, Zach? What should we do? So I'm not an oncologist, so I just told GPT-4, these are the mutations, and this is the cancer. And GPT-4 said, that's interesting. That's an extremely unusual set of mutations for that cancer. Typically, the mutations are this.
Mm.
I don't know if it's that cancer. So I went back to the wife of my colleague,
Hmm.
and I told her that, and they changed oncologists because it was correct.
Oh,
So this
wow.
guy, yeah. So this guy who had full access to the big healthcare system, a lot of
Yeah.
scientists, just so happened the oncologist made a mistake,
Mm.
and uh, and just using a second opinion, I actually was able to help my friend. And so there are many other such stories,
Yeah.
but the reality is, even in our best academic health centers, we do better when we talk to our colleagues
Hmm.
about cases. And when I was in training, we used to discuss every case seen in clinic after clinic. We no longer can do that. We just don't have the luxury of that time.
Right.
And so I think patients serve themselves well if they just say, okay, let me just run through so I understand. We do so much research on what car we buy or what refrigerator we buy. I think if we just did that much research using these tools on our current care plan, that's just a rational thing to do.
Yeah. I think that's a really powerful message to leave everybody with. So I think the future is bright. I mean, man, these are still the early days.
These are so much in early days. That's a thing. Perhaps the final thing to say is, oh my gosh, these things could not make a sentence 4 years ago,
Yeah.
and then were dumber than every medical student 3 years ago, and now are passing medical exams, which is not the end of, not the greatest measure of medical competence, but nonetheless are passing medical exams better than 90% of doctors. And that just happened in 3 years. There is no question in 2 years from now, we're going to be in a different place. So at
Yeah.
least everybody should stay tuned.
Yes. Excited to be on the ride with you. And thank you so much for your time today, Zach.
Jared, what a pleasure. Thank you.